It was early morning when passengers began boarding the long flight from Frankfurt to New York. The air inside the terminal was quiet, filled with the usual soft sounds of rolling luggage, muted voices, and the occasional flight announcement echoing overhead. The sky outside was a soft grey, and most travellers looked half asleep, holding coffee cups and searching for their seats. Among them walked an elderly Arabic man, his pace slow, but steady, his presence quiet and composed. He wore a traditional thobe, clean and pressed, and over his arm was a folded wool coat, the kind you might expect someone to carry who had seen many winters, and knew how to prepare for the cold. His small leather bag hung from one shoulder, simple, worn, but well cared for. He did not rush, he did not speak unless necessary, and when he reached the front of the business-class cabin, he paused, looked at his ticket, then moved forward toward the third row, his steps light, as if not to disturb anyone around him. The flight attendant at the front of the cabin glanced at him, then at the boarding pass in his hand. Her smile held for half a second. Before fading, she leaned ever so slightly toward her colleague and whispered something that only the nearby curtain caught. The sound of her lips curled downward, almost imperceptibly, as she tilted her head, and said in a voice too sweet to be sincere, "Sir, I believe this is business class." The man nodded and handed her his boarding pass. Without a word, she looked at it, her eyebrows raising as if surprise, and then stepped aside, letting him pass, though her eyes followed him with the kind of stare that speaks without needing sound. He placed his coat in the overhead bin with care, then sat down, window seat, third row, his hands folded neatly in his lap. As he waited for the flight to begin, outside the clouds began to shift, and the light changed, and inside the cabin passengers continued to board, oblivious to the moment that had just passed. Across the aisle, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a quiet gaze noticed something in the air, a certain hesitation, a small ripple like a breeze you feel before a storm, but cannot name yet. She watched as the man adjusted his seatbelt, his movements deliberate and respectful. She watched as the flight attendant passed by him again, without acknowledgement, without offering him the welcome she had given the others before him. He sat still, his face calm, but his eyes held something quiet and old, like a man who had learned over time to remain steady even when others could not. And so the plane filled slowly with the scent of coffee, the hum of conversation, and one moment of silent tension that no one had spoken about yet. But soon they would. The flight was now almost fully boarded, and the soft ding of the overhead chime signaled that the doors were about to close. Still, the elderly man in the third row remained unnoticed by most, but not by the flight attendant, who returned once more, this time with a tray of welcome drinks, smiling broadly as she approached the first two rows, offering orange juice water and champagne, her tone bright and cheerful, to each passenger she served. When she reached his row, she hesitated only for a moment. It was brief, almost invisible, but the woman across the aisle noticed it. The elderly man looked up politely and gave the same small nod he had given before, as if to say thank you in advance for the drink he would receive, but the attendant stepped past him entirely, her smile vanishing like a shadow pulled away by light. He did not say a word, just sat still, hands still folded, gaze turned back to the window as though nothing had happened at all. But the woman across the aisle lowered her book slightly, watching every detail, watching how the man exhaled just a little longer than normal, watching how his shoulders remained straight but still carried something heavy. The attendant continued serving without pause, and when she returned to collect the empty glasses, she skipped his row again, pretending not to see the empty cup holder in front of him, pretending not to hear the quiet clearing of his throat that may or may not have been a question. An hour passed, and the seatbelt sign turned off, and still the man had not been offered water, food, or even a blanket. He adjusted his position carefully, as if not to call attention to himself, and the woman now leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to understand what she was seeing, why this man, so respectful, so calm, was being treated as if he did not exist. She pressed the call button for the attendant, who arrived with the same forced smile, and asked, "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" And the woman said quietly, "The gentleman across from me has not been offered anything at all, no drink, no meal, no assistance. He is clearly a paying customer, and you seem to be going out of your way to ignore him." The attendant paused, her smile strained now. She glanced at the man who still had not spoken, and said in a voice lowered, "But not enough. I am doing my job, ma'am. And if some passengers make me uncomfortable, that is not something I can help with." The woman frowned and replied, "I do not see anything about him that should make anyone uncomfortable. He has been more polite than anyone else in this cabin, and if you cannot treat him with the same courtesy you give the rest of us, then I will speak to the head attendant myself." There was silence then, just for a moment, and though no one else had spoken, many were now listening, watching the way the man kept his eyes on the clouds outside, as if he had heard these things before, as if he had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant saying nothing at all. The airplane had reached cruising altitude, and the lights inside the cabin dimmed slightly as the crew began preparing for the first meal service. The quiet hum of the engines surrounded the passengers like a blanket of white noise, calming to some, forgettable to others. But the man in the third row was not resting, and neither was the woman across the aisle. She watched as the young flight attendant returned with the meal cart, her demeanor now more brisk, less friendly, her movements sharp and efficient, as if trying to hurry through the task. She smiled at the couple in the first row, offered both choices of chicken or fish, then did the same for the second row. But when she reached the third, she barely glanced at the elderly man, and without a word continued past him. His tray table remained folded, his seat untouched by any service, his eyes still watching the window, though the clouds had long since turned dark and featureless like smoke without fire. He turned slightly as if to speak, then stopped, choosing instead to fold his hands again in his lap. The woman finally spoke loud enough to be heard by the few seated near her. "I think you forgot someone," she said, pointing gently across the aisle. The attendant stiffened and turned slowly, her smile reappearing like a mask pulled quickly into place. "Oh," she said, "I thought he declined earlier, must have misunderstood." She did not look at him when she spoke, and he did not correct her. He simply looked forward, hands still folded. The woman shook her head softly, then turned to look ahead, as well, her eyes now carrying a quiet sharpness. In the row behind them, a man in his 60s leaned forward, clearly listening, and he whispered to his wife something about the situation, something about how the man had not been served a thing since the flight began, and she nodded slowly and clutched her scarf a little tighter. The attendant returned with a tray, finally setting it down in front of the elderly man without apology, without explanation. As if doing him a favor, he looked at the food, then gave a small nod that said thank you. Without saying thank you, he picked up the water, took a single sip, then placed it back down gently with both hands, as if even that was an act of discipline. The rest of the cabin went on as usual. Movies started, headphones on, conversations fading, but here in this row, and the one behind, a quiet tension lingered, not loud enough to break the silence, but sharp enough to be felt. There was something in the air now, something more than discomfort, more than suspicion, something that felt like a test being failed in real time. And though no one had raised their voice or stood from their seat, the story of what was happening was already being written in the glances, the whispers, and the silence. And still the man said nothing. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling quiet time, and passengers began reclining their seats or pulling blankets over their laps. The engines droned on, steady and low like a distant breath, but row 3 remained very still, too still, as if something in the air around it had forgotten how to rest. The elderly man had not touched his meal, though it had been placed in front of him over 20 minutes ago. The woman across from him, now watching more openly, no longer pretending not to notice his stillness, or the way the crew avoided his gaze like it carried heat. 2 more attendants had passed through the aisle, one pushing the tea cart, and one collecting wrappers and trays, but neither of them addressed him, neither made eye contact, neither acknowledged his presence. He was invisible, but not unnoticed. The man behind them, an older gentleman with silver hair and a quiet face, tapped the shoulder of the senior attendant as she walked by and asked politely why the man in front of him had been skipped during most of the service. She blinked, as if surprised, then leaned in and said softly, "I do not know, sir, but I will check on it." She did not return. The silver-haired man sat back slowly and looked ahead, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in a kind of old tired disappointment, the kind that comes from watching people forget their manners, not for the first time. The woman across the aisle pressed her call button again, this time with firmer intent, and when the same young attendant returned, she asked plainly, and without warmth, "Is there a reason this man is being treated differently? Because if there is, I believe the rest of us deserve to know." The attendant's smile cracked. She glanced at the man, then looked back at the woman, and said, "I have not done anything wrong. He has been given the same service as everyone else." Then she turned and left before a reply could come. The cabin felt colder after that, not physically, but in atmosphere, the kind of chill that follows a moment when something wrong is said, and no one has the words to fix it. The man finally moved, adjusting his seatbelt, and reaching slowly into the small bag by his feet, he took out a thin notebook and a pen, and began to write something in careful script, his hand steady, despite the trembling in the cabin, his face unreadable. Another passenger, now watching from the opposite aisle, a young man with headphones halfway off his ears, leaned in just enough to hear the soft scratching of pen to paper. Something about it felt ancient, private, powerful. And still not a word was spoken aloud by the man, not a single complaint, not even a sigh. But now more people were watching, now more people were wondering, and as eyes began turning slowly toward row 3, something in the air shifted slightly, like a tide pulling back just before the wave breaks. Something was coming. As the minutes ticked by, the plane continued its steady hum, cutting through the night sky. But something in the air felt different now. Passengers had begun to shift in their seats, subtly stealing glances at row 3, some leaning in slightly, trying to understand what was happening, some choosing not to look at all, but the weight of the moment hung heavier than the clouds outside. The woman across the aisle who had first spoken out watched the man closely, her heart heavy with the knowledge that something was wrong, but unsure how to fix it. Her hand rested on her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her scarf, her eyes flickering from the elderly man to the young flight attendant who had just passed by again without so much as a glance. It wasn't just the ignoring of his needs that bothered her anymore. It was the way the man was being treated, like he wasn't even there, like his presence had somehow become a stain on the cabin, too awkward to acknowledge, too inconvenient to accommodate. Her chest tightened with the realization that no one had dared speak up before her. No one had questioned why the man was being treated differently. They had all been so caught up in their own small worlds, so wrapped up in their own routines, that they had failed to see the quiet injustice happening right in front of them. But that was changing now. The man behind her, an older gentleman with a cane who had been watching the whole time, shifted in his seat and leaned forward, tapping the shoulder of the flight attendant who had been avoiding row 3. He asked her directly, with a low and steady voice, "I don't mean to be rude, but why has this gentleman been ignored for so long?" The attendant looked startled for a moment, then composed herself, as though she had been caught doing something wrong. She cleared her throat and said in a clipped tone, "He has been served as everyone else has been served, sir. But if you're concerned, I can check again." He looked at her with a steady gaze and replied, "I don't believe you are doing your job properly. I've seen him sit there for the past 2 hours without a single person offering him so much as a glass of water. Now, I don't know what's going on, but I know it isn't right." The attendant paused for a long moment, her gaze flickering back and forth between the elderly man and the other passengers, now turning their attention toward the exchange. She seemed to realize the eyes of the cabin were upon her now, the weight of the entire situation bearing down on her shoulders. But still the elderly man did not speak. He had not made a sound since boarding the plane. He simply sat there with his hands folded and his eyes turned slightly toward the window. It was then that the younger woman sitting in the row across from him stood up and turned to face the attendant with quiet determination. She said what everyone else had been thinking: enough is enough. I want you to explain to me why he's being treated this way. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted entirely now. There was a subtle yet palpable tension in the air, like the quiet before a storm. Passengers who had once been content to ignore the subtle injustices happening now looked on openly, some shifting in their seats, and others glancing nervously toward the attendants. And still the elderly man did nothing but sit calmly, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze never moving from the small window beside him. The young woman who had stood up now looked directly at the flight attendant. She wasn't shouting or demanding. She simply asked with quiet strength, enough is enough. You owe him an explanation, and you owe it to all of us to show some decency. The attendant shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the woman's gaze, but still she tried to hide her discomfort behind her practiced smile. I'm sorry, ma'am, but he's already been served. We've had a very busy flight, and I've done my job. The woman didn't back down. She continued to stand, her voice steady, and her eyes unblinking. You've done your job, yes. But have you done it with respect? She asked. And what kind of job requires you to treat someone like they aren't even here? She gestured toward the elderly man still sitting motionless. But there was a strength in his stillness, a quiet dignity that made his silence even louder than words. It was at that moment that the woman across the aisle from the elderly man, who had been watching him this whole time, finally spoke up. I don't know who you think you're fooling, but we've all seen how you've treated him, she said, her voice carrying the truth of the situation, her eyes locking onto the attendants with an intensity that made it clear she wasn't backing down. The attendant looked at her, and then at the man in the third row, whose calm presence seemed to be a silent rebuke to her actions, and the eyes of the entire cabin turned on her now, all waiting for her to say something that could explain the behavior. But there was nothing she could say that would make it right not anymore. It was then that the senior flight attendant, who had been quietly observing the situation from the front of the plane, approached the row with a steady but concerned look on her face. She knew what was happening, but still hadn't quite understood how it had gotten to this point. She knelt beside the elderly man and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Sir, she began, I must apologize for the way you've been treated today. It is completely unacceptable, and I'd like to make it right. The elderly man slowly turned his head to face her, his eyes still soft, but there was something in them now that made everyone hold their breath, something more than just the quiet patience he had shown the entire flight. He cleared his throat softly and said with a voice as calm as his demeanor, it is not your apology that matters, but the actions that follow it. And with that the room fell into an uncomfortable silence as the reality of the situation settled over everyone. The senior flight attendant stood there for a moment with her hand on the elderly man's shoulder. The silence in the cabin was thick like a fog that no one dared disturb. Every eye in the room was on them, waiting for something to break the stillness. And then the man finally spoke again, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of something much larger than anyone in that cabin had expected. He turned slowly to face the attendant, his eyes steady and calm, and said with quiet authority, you do not know who I am, do you? The question hung in the air for a moment, and the attendant blinked as if the words had caught her off guard. No, she said quietly, I do not know your name, sir, but I do know you've been treated unfairly, and I'm deeply sorry for that. The elderly man nodded as though he expected her answer, and then slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Pulling out a small leather wallet, he opened it slowly, revealing a single card. And as he handed it to the senior attendant, his fingers were steady, but there was a weight to them, like he had been carrying something for far too long without ever letting anyone see the burden. She took the card carefully, her hands trembling just slightly, and looked down at it for a moment before her eyes widened in shock, and she gasped as if the world itself had shifted beneath her feet. The card was official, looking embossed with gold, and stamped with letters in a language she couldn't quite read. But the one thing she recognized was the symbol at the top, the seal of a country she had only ever heard of in whispers. She looked up at him now, her face pale, and the words stuck in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice cracking slightly as the reality of the moment set in. He sat there in perfect stillness for a long moment, the whole cabin waiting in silence, as if the air itself had paused for him to speak. And then he finally spoke again, but this time his voice held something else, a quiet power that no one had realized he possessed until now. "I am a man who has seen much in my years. I have traveled through many lands and met many people, but I have never been treated like this before," he said, and his words rang with a quiet authority that seemed to echo across the cabin. The entire plane had fallen silent now, the other passengers looking on in confusion and awe. But no one moved, no one dared speak as the elderly man continued with his story slowly and deliberately. "I am an ambassador from a foreign nation," he said, his voice steady and sure, "and I've traveled to many countries to represent my people, but never have I encountered such disregard as I have on this flight today." The senior attendant's face flushed a deep red as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had not simply disrespected a man, she had disrespected someone whose position was far above hers, whose experience and dignity far outweighed any authority she could claim in that moment. And all around the cabin passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some with faces of disbelief, others with growing understanding, as the truth of the man's identity slowly began to dawn on them. But still the elderly man sat there with the same calm, unshaken presence as he had since the moment he boarded. The silence in the cabin was now absolute. No one dared speak, no one dared move. It was as if the entire plane was holding its breath. The elderly man sat in his seat, still as ever, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a storm cloud just waiting to burst. And the senior attendant, who had been kneeling beside him, now stood frozen with the official card in her hand, her face flushed with embarrassment and disbelief. Around her the other passengers looked from one to another, some with expressions of shock, others with their hands covering their mouths in realization. But no one said a word, not even the woman across the aisle who had been the first to speak up. The elderly man looked at the senior attendant and then at the passengers, who were now watching him with wide eyes, his gaze soft but piercing, as if he could see right through them, as if he understood the weight of their thoughts and their shame without needing to hear a single word. He let the silence linger for a moment longer before finally speaking again, but this time his voice was softer, gentler. "There is no need for apologies," he said quietly, "but there is something that must be understood." He paused, and the whole cabin waited as if his words were being carved into the air with precision. He continued, "You may not have known who I was, but the way I have been treated was not a matter of position or status. It was a matter of respect and human decency. There are many people in this world who will be treated as less than others simply because of who they are, or where they come from, or how they speak. And this must change." He paused again, letting his words sink into the minds of everyone who had been watching him. The senior attendant stood motionless, her hands still trembling, but now in shame, and the woman across the aisle looked down, her eyes wet with emotion. For the first time in what felt like hours, the elderly man finally turned his gaze to her and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, his eyes filled with quiet understanding, but also with a silent thank you for speaking out when no one else would. The senior attendant finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. And she looked down at the card, still in her hand, with a mix of guilt and humility. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have treated you with the respect you deserve." The elderly man nodded slowly. "I am not the one who needs an apology," he said to her quietly. "You owe it to yourself to treat everyone with kindness and dignity regardless of who they are or where they come from, and it is in this that we all find our humanity." Around the cabin, there was a collective shift. The passengers, who had been silent now, began to murmur softly among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others still trying to process the weight of what had just unfolded. And though the tension had not completely dissipated, there was something different now, something that felt like the first light of dawn after a long dark night. And still the elderly man sat there calm and unbothered, as if he had expected this, all along, knowing that in the end it wasn't about who he was or what title he held. It was about the way we treat each other when no one is looking. The plane continued its journey through the night sky, and the cabin slowly returned to normal. But for those who had witnessed what had just happened, they would never forget the lesson that had been silently shared by the quiet man in row 3.